Welcome back to the Total Party Kitchen Adventures, the show where we go through the official Dungeons & Dragons cookbook called Heroes Feast and use dice roll to determine what we're going to be making this week. So let's get into the dice roll and see what the dice decide. 34. Okay, so that is going to be Delzoun's Tide Me Overs. This is from the Dwarf section, and I'm going to read a quick synopsis of what the recipe says here. It says beef, pork, onions, and a smattering of dwarven seasoning are all rolled up into these delicious little balls that are ideal for snacking or as a main banquet course. These meatballs, as they're known to many across the multiverse, are sometimes served with a side of freshly crushed tart berries for the dwarves on the go, but they're best when drenched with a sweet, dark dwarven gravy made with chicken broth and enlivened with brown sugar, lemon, and soy sauce. While these are customary consumables at Hornmoot, the traditional human-dwarf trading festival that marks the dawn of spring, there isn't a holiday on the eventful dwarven calendar that doesn't feature these scrumptious meats on the menu. And who doesn't love meatballs? So we were really excited to get into this one. And just a little side note here, the recipe calls for 8 ounces of ground pork and 8 ounces of ground lean beef. And since the grocery store pretty much sells them in a pound, we decided instead of having half the meat left over, we just decided to make a double batch of this. So you're going to see our recipe. We're going to do twice as much, but I will let you know what the recipe says and what we did to kind of show the difference. And you'll see when we go to put them in the oven how full our tray is. It's a little ridiculous, but go big or go home. So let's jump right into the making, and we'll talk about it as we go. Okay, so the recipe calls for 1 small yellow onion. As you can see here, this is not a small yellow onion. It's a much larger onion. We've already peeled the skin off, and it asks for it to be finely chopped, so we're starting here by just kind of slicing each half into thin strips, and then we're going to go back and chop it into a much finer pieces. It's really important to be consistent because you want the onion to cook consistently. Any large pieces, you can find a big chunk of raw onion, or even like a big just chunk of onion in a meatball. If you chop them consistently, it makes for an overall better product because you have meatballs then, not meatballs with chunks of onion in it, and it's just overall better. So you just want to make sure that you chop them finely. As you can see here, we're going to start kind of getting it into the smaller pieces that we need. And again, consistency is key. That way it cooks evenly. And then we're going to move on to a little bit more prep here. This is parsley. The recipe calls for fresh parsley or dill. We didn't have dill at the local market, so we went with fresh parsley. And we're just going to cut the stems off, and then we're going to chop it down as fine as we can. Now, the recipe calls for 3 tablespoons. Again, we're making a double batch, so we need 6, which is about a little more than a quarter of a cup. So if you use this much parsley and you make the normal batch, this is way too much. But you're just going to chop it as fine as you can. This parsley goes into the sauce, which is a much later step. We're going to prep it ahead of time. And you can see we're going to cut it as small as we can. We're going to go back and chop up, make sure there's no large leaves. You don't want a big giant leaf, showing up in your sauce later on. Okay, now that that's done, we're going to start with the meatballs. This part was a much longer process than anything we've made before. And the recipe calls for 1 egg, so we're going to use 2. And then the recipe is going to call for a 1/4 cup of heavy cream. So we will end up using a 1/2 cup. And like I said, this particular recipe There were more steps in this than any that we've done so far, so this video is a bit longer, and there's just a lot more ingredients and a lot more steps. And here we go, we got the cream coming now. So again, half a cup of cream goes in with the eggs. And then we're going to whisk it together. You don't want to do this too much. You could end up with some sort of weird eggy whipped cream. So we're really just looking to combine the two into one. It's kind of like a custard, I suppose, eggs and cream. And we're just going to mix it until it's combined completely. Just about there. And then the recipe calls for 2 slices of a dark bread such as rye. We opted to go with pumpernickel instead of rye, basically because I really dig pumpernickel, and that's what I wanted to get. So we took 4 slices since we're making a double batch, and we're just tearing it up. You don't have to be real precise with this. It doesn't have to be consistent size. Really, what we just want is the bread to have as much surface area exposed to the liquid as possible, because we really want it to sop up all that kind of custard that you made there and be absorbed into the bread. We're going to set this aside for a bit. The recipe calls for putting it aside for 20 minutes to really absorb all that liquid. I don't think we quite left it for 20 minutes, but we leave it for a while. And so you really just want it to absorb all that. And we'll come back to that. So now we're going over to the stove, and we have a frying pan on the stove with 2 tablespoons of butter. We're letting it melt down there. And this is what we're going to be adding the onions to. So again, you'd add your small onion, or in our case, this giant onion that we used. And you're just going to want to stir this occasionally. I wouldn't say continually. But you definitely don't want them brown. What we're really looking for is them to just soften up, let out some of their onion juices, and to almost become like a translucent is really what we're looking for here. And we're going to add some salt. And there we go. So it's been about 4 minutes. They're kind of cooked down. They're translucent, or on their way to being translucent. And then we're going to add the ground allspice. So the recipe calls for a 1/4 teaspoon. So we're using 1/2 teaspoon. Should be coming up here in a second. And then basically you're just going to mix this in and let it cook for 30-40 seconds. Just so it gets aromatic. You don't really want to let it go any longer than that. So we'll just mix it in here. And give that a few seconds to try to just, start letting off those good smells. And then we're going to take it off the heat and set it aside. And you're going to want to let this cool to room temperature, because this is going to go into the meatballs, and you don't really want to be handling scalding hot onions. It's not a good time. So once this is combined, we're just going to take it off the heat and set it aside and let it cool down. And at this point, we're going to set the oven to 475 to preheat. There we go. And we're going to prep the tray. So we're going to take a cooking sheet and a wire rack. You can spray that down with some cooking spray if you don't want it to stick. And we're going to take an extra step here and put down some parchment paper. This is not necessary by any stretch of the imagination. It just makes cleanup easier. You throw the parchment paper away. You give the sheet a quick scrub, and you're done. If you don't use the parchment paper, it can take much longer to clean that baking sheet. So we want to save ourselves some time later. And there we go. So now we have our tray ready, and we have our oven heating, and now it's time to make the meatballs. So we're going to go back to that bread that's been sitting for a while, and we're going to take a fork, and we're just going to mash that up to really make sure it's combined, that it's absorbed all the liquid. And what we're really looking for is like a bread paste. The eggs and the bread is really what's going to hold the meatballs together. So we're just going to mash this up, almost like an oatmeal consistency. And we didn't think it was going to be enough liquid to really get what we're looking for, but we were surprised as we went. It all kind of got absorbed and mashed together, and really ended up exactly what we needed. But if you feel like you need a little bit more, throw another tablespoon of cream in there, but don't go crazy, because you definitely don't want it to be soggy, because then you're gonna have trouble keeping your the structure of your meatball is not going to stay together. So we're just about at that point where it's at a paste consistency. And now we're going to combine the rest of the ingredients for the meatballs. And here is those onions that we had let cool to room temperature. And now we're going to add the main ingredients, and the meatballs, the meat. And again, this is the part where we decided to make a double batch, simply because, why have leftovers when you can just turn it all into meatballs? So we're going to go with 16 ounces or 1 pound of ground pork. The recipe calls for 8 ounces. So if you have plans to make a meatloaf or something else, you can, put the other 8 ounces aside, or you can just, go for the gusto and do what we did. So there it is. It's 1 pound of ground pork. Now we're going to add 1 pound of lean ground beef. So there's that. And then the surprise ingredient from my perspective that I had never heard of is baking powder. So we're going to add, the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking powder, so we add 2. And I never heard of this. Thank God Roman's half-orc barbarian is a cook and took the cook feat, because he had heard of this. And apparently it helps browning and giving the meatballs a bit of a crust. I really like the way they came out, so I'm definitely going to be doing this in meatballs in the future. This was a good little trick to learn. And then to this as well, we're going to add 2 teaspoons of salt and a teaspoon of pepper. And we pretty much just eyeballed this. We have grinders. We don't have a measurable, or easily measurable way of doing it. So we kind of just eyeballed the salt and the pepper. And I feel like both of those ingredients are something you can do to taste. So if that's not quite as much as pepper as you like, you can always add a little bit more. And then the recipe says that you can use a spoon, but I don't know why you would. I feel like the only way to make meatballs is by hand. So why wouldn't you combine all this meat and ingredients by hand? So that's what we're going to do. Make sure you wash your hands. Oh, no, Roman, go wash your hands. There we go. So now he's back, and he's going to just combine this. And you really want it to be a consistent color and texture. So you want to really kind of work it and combine everything. It takes a little bit of time, but it's well worth it in the end. You don't want your meatballs to have weird large chunks of bread paste, or half the meatball be just ground pork. And so you really want it to be combined into like one consistent color and texture. All right, now here we are. It's pretty consistent all the way through. You can't kind of like pick out one ingredient over another. And so now it's time to kind of start making them into meatballs. So we're going to get our tray, and then our half-orc chef here is going to show us the squeeze, the squeeze method. I believe that's what he called it. I'd never really seen anyone make meatballs this way, but it made a lot of sense. And allowed for some really consistently sized meatballs. So we're going to kind of scrape a little bit of meat off our fingers here and get the tray ready. No one said meatballs is a neat food, so. So now we got our tray ready. And this is the squish method that he's going to illustrate here. He just takes a handful and just kind of squishes it, and it'll ooze up between his thumb and his first finger. And apparently this way he can control the size better. It's more consistent. You can make them into about a tablespoon and a half size. You can see here, he just squeezes it, breaks off a little bit, firms it up with his other hand, and puts it on the rack. And you're just going to fill up the rack this way. And apparently this is a method that they use for a lot of different things, sometimes pastries and anything that you kind of want ball-shaped. You can see how quickly we're filling up that tray. We kind of cut out the part where we overfilled it, but you'll see when it goes in the oven that it is jam-packed full of meatballs because we went a little hog wild on them. But you know what? They were great, so I don't mind. There we go. Look at how neat that looks. Now we're going to pop them into the oven. And you can see the tray is suddenly loaded with not marshmallows, meatballs. And we're going to pop them in for 20 minutes. So halfway through, we give them a turn. So we set the Alexa for 10 minutes and then turned them and gave them another 10 in the 475-degree oven. Now we cut back to, this is the same frying pan. We wiped out the onions that we had made. Now we have 4 more tablespoons of butter. So at this point, the recipe would have called for 2. And we're letting that melt down. This is the beginning of the sauce. So we're going to add to this. We're basically going to make a roux, which is a flour and butter mixture. And this will thicken up the sauce. So you do this ahead of time. You can't just add flour to the sauce to thicken it. It just makes it chunky. So we are going to be adding to this 4 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. The recipe calls for 2, but again, we're making a double batch here, so we add 4. And then you just whisk this. You don't want to stop whisking it. You want to keep it moving because that flour basically absorbs all the butter. And if you just leave it, it's going to brown and cook and burn. So we do want it to brown somewhat, but you got to keep it moving. So we gave it, I think we gave it 3 minutes or so. Till it became like a golden brown color. Again, you can kind of eyeball it. If you want your sauce a little darker, you can keep going, make it a little darker color. And this is just about where we wanted it, this golden brown color. And then to this, the recipe calls for 1 1/3 cup low sodium chicken broth. So to this, we're adding 2 2/3 cups. And that should be coming up in a second here. We're just finishing up the roux. And here we go. So you want to whisk this as you pour it in. And you want to pour it in relatively slow. So there's 2 cups. We're going to add 2/3 cups. Here comes the rest of the broth. And then we're going to keep continually whisking this. It doesn't have to be so aggressive, but you're going to see it kind of start to thicken up. And that's what you're looking for. You kind of eyeball it however thick you want it. If it's not thick enough, you just keep cooking it. Some of the liquid will evaporate and make it a thicker sauce. But this is about where we want it. So we're going to add the remainder of the ingredients just about at this point. And we're going to add the brown sugar, and that is 2 teaspoons of light brown sugar, since the recipe calls for 1. Then we're going to be adding some soy sauce. We had some struggles with this particular bottle because it had the eyedropper attachment, so we opted to go with a different one. But the recipe calls for 1.5 teaspoons, so we're going to go with 3 teaspoons. That one took too long, so we're going to switch bottles now. There's 2. One more will be 3. So that's 3 tablespoons of soy sauce. And then we're going to do 1 teaspoon of fresh lemon, since 1/2 teaspoon is called for. Here we go. 1 teaspoon of lemon juice. And that goes in. And then we're going to mix that up. Again, keep stirring it. And we're going to let this kind of cook through and thicken up, maybe 2 minutes or so. This sauce comes together pretty quickly. So you can wait until your meatballs are done in order to start the sauce. I think we started right when we turned them at the 10-minute point, and that worked out pretty well. It's just about time to add in those final ingredients. So here comes that parsley that we chopped way back in the beginning. You can see the meatballs there on the far side of the stove. And the sauce is just about done. And then we'll be adding the parsley. It's the last ingredient. So here it comes. That's that parsley that we chopped up back in the beginning. I'm going to whisk the rest of that in, incorporate it all the way through. And then we're going to put in the meatballs. Again, we went pretty crazy with the meatballs, but we managed to fit them all into that skillet, if you can imagine. So they are hot, so we grab some tongs. Oops. Sorry about that camera move. So we grab some tongs to put the meatballs in there. And we're just going to load up that pot, or that frying pan, with all the meatballs. Give them a good stir, toss them in amongst the sauce to get them completely coated. these were really, really good. Who doesn't like meatballs? It was probably, it's definitely, I think it was my favorite thing that we've made from the Heroes Feast cookbook so far. They were delicious. I would definitely make them for a night of D&D. They were pretty simple. They weren't overly complicated, and I think it maybe, I don't think it took us more than an hour to do this from chopping the onion to plating. So it really didn't take that long. You can put them out at your table. We do have a vegan that plays with us, so may not be her jam, but pretty sure everybody else would be down for them. You're going to have to figure out if it's for your table or not. So we just about got all these meatballs here into the frying pan. A couple more to go. And then just give them a toss, give them a stir, make sure everything's heated through. Give them another 3 or 4 minutes to cook into the sauce, and then plate them. They're ready to go. We put a little sprig of parsley on top just to make it a little fancy, and that's pretty much it. They're very simple. A great appetizer if you had a party or something. Serve them in a plate with some toothpicks and people could have at them. Definitely a dish I would make again. They're great. Again, I love meatballs. I don't understand who wouldn't enjoy them, but very simple, delicious, and I would highly recommend anyone who likes that sort of thing to give this recipe a try. It's not quite as simple as some of the other ones we've tried, but it's definitely not hard. It's I wouldn't even call it an intermediate recipe. It's kind of still a beginner recipe, very easy, doable. You could definitely do this with the kids. Again, you're working with some hot frying pans, so you wouldn't let them make it alone, but it'd be a good family fun recipe to try. And again, another hit out of the park for the Heroes Feast cookbook. And I'm looking forward to the next recipe. And as always, thank you for checking out our show. Make sure you check our other episodes on the playlist. Comment, like, subscribe, share it with your friends. And we will see you again next time when the dice decide what it is we're going to make. And until that, make sure you go try some meatballs, man. Give it a go. And let us know how they turned out. And thanks again for watching.